Okay, good morning all. Sorry for the delay at the start, and welcome to this meeting of the Built Heritage Subcommittee. Any declarations of interest this morning? No. Confirmation of minutes. Can we confirm the minutes of 11 January 2018? Are those carried? Great. Okay, so we have two substantive items before us this morning. The first is an application for demolition and new construction at 50 Lakeway Drive, property designated under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act and located in the Rockcliffe Park Heritage Conservation District. I don't have any speakers signed up for this item, and so I guess my question for the committee is whether we can pass this on consent. I guess a question for, actually there is one speaker, which is the architect representing the client, and the question is, if the committee is prepared to pass this item, do you need to speak? I'm looking for the architect. Hi. Okay, great. So okay. Okay, you go ahead then.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one of the things I noticed in your report, you referenced the original Rockcliffe Park guidelines. You note that the guidelines anticipate that buildings may be demolished and replaced in, the Rockcliffe Park Heritage Conservation District, which is fine. Yet in the city's survey and evaluation form, it states that the street's importance lies in it being part of a new Rockcliffe subdivision of 1949, specifically whose houses reflect the influence of modernists such as Frank Lloyd Wright, Walter Gropius, and Mies van der Rohe, and further that the property is one of several mid-20th century residences which relate to each other in materials and design. I'm prepared to support the staff recommendation on this because but the report does deal with it as a building on a lot within the district. I'm not seeing anywhere in your report where you reference the role of the street or the role of the house vis-a-vis the street or vis-a-vis this subdivision. And I guess my question is really more about whether or not you consider this mid-century, low-rise, modernist area as contributing to the history of Rockcliffe Park Village.
Can you repeat that, please? We're having trouble with the question.
Okay. In short, I guess my question is, the report deals with the building in terms of its relationship to its lot within the park, and not its contribution to what has been described in the city's evaluation form as contributing to an enclave or subdivision from the mid-20th century, which had a uniform sort of look and feel in terms of all the buildings being of 1 and 1.5 stories, sharing materials, etc. So I'm just wondering, you haven't addressed that, and my question is just sort of more on a general level, because we saw something similar last time we met. The property I'm talking about. Yeah. So I'm just wondering how the staff interprets that.
Through you, Mr. Chair. The property is on Lakeway Drive. Many of them on the opposite side of the street from subject property at 50 Lakeway have been sort of turned over, and while there's a lot of 2-story houses there, and a lot of the 1-story bungalows have actually, the ones that are not contributing, so grade 2, have been lost over the years, and so we factor that into our analysis.
So do you think more have gone than are still there? Or?
I think so, yes.
Okay. So, but just generally speaking, that's not really an issue, because we are talking about a Part 5 designation as opposed to a Part 4. So just that more holistic perspective. Anyhow, thank you very much. That was just my comment, and I guess a little bit reflecting a concern that I have as well about how we approach these things. Thank you, Ashley.
Member Quinn, maybe I can help you by asking a different question. Are there any houses in this portion that you mentioned in the report that have been scored as contributing buildings? So any of the modernist buildings in this area?
There are in the district, Mr. Chair, modernist buildings that are contributing. There are fewer on this side of the lake just because the contributing scores are a result of analysis of three things: architecture, history, and design. So there are a couple on this side and more on the other side of the lake.
Thank you. Okay, so if there are no other questions and comments, is this item carried? Okay, thank you. And thank you for coming out this morning. So item 2 is an application to permit the demolition of the Ugandan High Commission, 231 Coburg Street, a property located in the Wilbrod-Laurier Heritage Conservation District, and an application for new construction on the same site. So we're going to start by asking staff to provide a brief presentation of this item, please.
Can I confirm that this is the same PowerPoint that's on the members' screens or not? My deepest apologies, members of the committee. I changed the order of the slides yesterday, but I did not add any new ones, so you might have to look at the big screen rather than the little screen for the first 6, and then it goes back to what you have. So this application is in front of you today as an application for Sorry, the chair is awkward. Application for demolition and new construction in the Wilbrod-Laurier Heritage Conservation District. The subject property is located at the corner of Wilbrod. Oh, this isn't working. How does that happen? Oh, there we go. At the corner of Wilbrod and Coburg and Wilbrod Streets. This is the subject property. It and the adjacent 2 buildings were constructed in the 1940s, replacing a large 19th century house that on a very large lot. Immediately to the north and out of the district is a 1970s house. The Heritage Conservation District encompasses both sides of Wilbrod, from Chapel to Charlotte, and bits of Augusta and Coburg Street. The district is distinguished by a number of large embassy, mostly housed in 19th century houses. They include Brazil, Brunei, Australia, and France has a building too. It's not their embassy, but there's a number of these large houses that have been adapted for use by embassies. In addition, there is at 243 Augusta a designated property which is known as the Part 4 designated property also, which is known as the Pearson House. In amongst these 19th century buildings, there are a number of new infill structures, for example, interspersed with the older building stock. The Wilbrod-Laurier Heritage Conservation District was designated in 1982. It operated without any kind of plan or guidelines until 2015, when Council approved the new HCD plan according to the post-2005 revisions to the Ontario Heritage Act. The Wilbrod-Laurier plan describes the district as an excellent example of a late 19th century upper middle class residential districts with an eclectic mix of 19th century architectural styles, including the Queen Anne Revival, Italianate Gothic Revival, and then early 20th Edwardian Classicism. It's primarily composed of single detached houses residential in character because many of them are no longer used as houses, mostly 2 to 3 stories in height, and there's a consistent use of buildings. And this is all taken from the HCD plan. I'm just summarizing it for you. Also, characteristics of the district are large covered front porches, generous front lawns, consistent side yard setbacks, historic streets layout and lot pattern, but not everywhere, because where there's been subdivisions like this or lots created through severance, the street pattern is interrupted, and it's also characterized by deciduous street trees and boulevards. So that is what the HCD, how it is described in the attributes that are a requirement of every HCD plan. The following slides will show the current building, as I said, constructed in 1941, replacing a larger house. The 2 adjacent buildings were also constructed at the same time. The building, built as a flat-roofed 2-unit building, was built as a 2-unit building with a shared front entrance. It features simple, shallow quoins, a frontispiece, and a modest cornice. 8/8 windows also. The building never had any outdoor space or balconies. From 1955 to 1958, Lester Pearson and his wife owned one of the units in the building. At the time, he was Minister of External Affairs and had offices in the East Bloc. In 1957, during his tenure there, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his work establishing a peacekeeping force in Egypt during the 1956 Suez Crisis, prompted by Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal. Although he lived at 231 Coburg when he received the prize, the building is not explicitly or meaningfully associated or identified with his work at the time, which mostly took place at the UN. So this shows the Wilbrod side of the building. So that's the south facade. And this shows the current parking, and this is a shared right-of-way, and so this is the north side of the building. The Ontario Heritage Act requires council approval for new construction and demolition of buildings within heritage conservation districts. The current application is to demolish the existing building, and which now serves and has served since the 1980s as the High Commission of Uganda. The current application proposes the demolition of the building and the construction of a 3-story replacement building. The proposal also requires site plan approval and a rezoning, and those are on the Planning Committee agenda for February 27th. So the staff recommendation is to approve the application to demolish the building and to approve the application for new construction. The following slides will show some of the issues related to the structure of the property. This slide shows some of the walls that are the result, or there has been differential settling of the property for a number of years. And this shows how that differential settling has resulted in cracks in the building. An engineering study in 2013, which was the first of 2 engineering studies that have been associated with this project, in which staff have consulted, attributed the cracking of the building to the desiccation of the clay soils in Sandy Hill as a result of the hot summers in the late 1990s, and again in 2011 and 2012. Certainly, members of the heritage staff are very familiar with the increased cracking throughout the downtown that was the result of the desiccation and the shrinking of clay soils as a result of climate change. This engineering study also found that there was localized desiccation as a result of adjacent trees that were searching for moisture and further pulling water out. The settling and cracking of the High Commission prompted the Ugandans to leave their offices there in 2014. Because there was a feeling that it was no longer safe. Throughout their tenancy that started in 1985 to 2014, there were attempts to repair the cracking and solve some of the issues. In 2015, there was another engineering report commissioned by the High Commission, and it described in detail the construction methods of the building, the masonry block, wood frame, concrete floor, which all led to this cracking. And like the 2013 report, the 2015 report confirmed that the cause of the cracking was differential settlement. And then there were further studies that looked at how to repair the building, and the solution was piles driven in to the ground to a depth of 20 meters before you could find bedrock and settle it down. And it's much more technical than that, but that's a synopsis. There's also been at least 2 geotechnical reports that confirm the causes of the settling that also date from 2013. So here's some more of the cracking evident around the windows. This slide shows a footprint of the building on its site and the associated landscape and trees. The proposed building is on roughly the same footprint as the existing building. After 2 years of discussion and many early versions, the applicant came in with an application in April 2017 that Heritage staff, along with our urban design and land use planning colleagues, worked with the applicant to improve to be consistent with the Wilbrod-Laurier HCD guidelines. There were 11 major changes suggested to the building as a result of this work with the applicant. These include the lowering of the building so that the wheelchair ramp, which is here, could be entirely located to the front of the building. Lowering the height of the building, so that was the result of lowering the height of the building. A setting back of the 3rd floor, using gray instead of white tiles on the 3rd floor, setting back the rooftop terrace, adding windows to so there's the front. You can see the differences. Here, this is the lowered profile, etc. And further recommendations were adding windows on the south side to create a more residential character, making one simple staircase to the front door, whereas the revisions had shown a more complicated entrance, and improving the landscaping to create a more residential feel to this corner in the district. And there were ongoing discussions about this window and its division, and I think that the applicant is still, that there could be further refinements to give the building a more residential character. So here again we have the previous version and the current version with the increased landscaping and a buffer along the street, which currently doesn't exist, so this is an improvement. And here we have the more domestic and windows that speak to the fenestration patterns throughout the Heritage District. Again, these are just, again, elevations because just for more details. So the Wilbrod-Laurier Heritage Conservation District guidelines talk about new buildings, and that they will contribute and not detract from the heritage character, and that they should be of their own time and not attempt to replicate an historic style. So again, doesn't replace a 1941 building. The building is a 1940 building replacing an earlier one. Oh no, the new one does. Sorry. mixed up. Yes, it replaces the 1941 building. It is of its own time, does not replicate any historic style, is sympathetic to the HCD as its design is inspired by the facade proportions, fenestration pattern, and flat roof of the original. The HCD guidelines also address cladding materials, and in this case, the building is red brick to reflect the character of the HCD, and the third floor is in gray panels that evoke gable ends in the district. They talk about windows in new buildings that should be vertically aligned, and these windows are aligned to reflect traditional window patterns in the HCD. Next, the standards and guidelines that have been adopted by council talk about conserve the heritage value of an historic place. The building will not have a negative impact on the defined heritage characters of the HCD, and the landscaping proposed is an enhancement to the current landscaping, so that meets standard 1. Standard 11 talks about conserving the heritage value and character defining elements when creating any new additions to an historic place. So this is an addition to an historic place as a new building within the Heritage Conservation District. And again, the use of brick, regular window openings, the flat roof, and simple landscape plan are compatible with the mixed character of the HCD. There was a cultural heritage impact statement undertaken at the request of the city, and its conclusion was that the building is appropriate for the area, and that it fitted into the Heritage Conservation District. I should say that within the staff report, there were 3 recommendations which were in the cultural heritage impact statement about recommendations to further refine it to be more residential in character. And the staff has looked at those, and I'm certain that if there is interest, we can continue to work with the applicant. I should say that the guideline about demolition in the Heritage Conservation District study is that demolition is not normally supported, and in this particular instance, that's why I went through the heritage, extensive work on the structure as a result of the two engineering reports and geotech reports, just to show that this was very closely considered, is, again, it's not normally recommended, but we did feel that in this particular instance the evidence was enough to warrant not objecting to the demolition of the building. So consultation, Councillor Fleury does not support the proposal. Action Sandy Hill does not support the proposal. This was Heritage Ottawa did not comment. That I just got those comments and they've been circulated to you. I didn't get a chance to change the slide. My apologies. Neighbours were notified, and there was a public meeting that 6 people attended, organized by the councillor, that the applicant was there and his heritage consultant, so both architect and consultant were there, and the 6 people at that meeting also did not support the application. So, in conclusion, as a mid-20th century replacement building in a 19th century district noted for its upper middle class houses, range of eclectic building styles, the building is a marginal architectural value. It is not explicitly or meaningfully identified with the work of Lester Pearson during his tenure there. The structural damage to the building as a result of unstable soil conditions have rendered it unsafe. So Heritage staff supports the application for demolition and that's the last slide. And the new construction in the heritage of the Ugandan embassy, as developed in close consultation with the architect to reflect the Heritage Conservation District guidelines. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. We do have a number of speakers registered. So I will call those speakers up in order that they appeared on the list. So first on the list, sorry, Mr. Lester?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to indicate that in consultation with some of the members of the committee, it is looking like there would be a motion to refuse the application coming from this committee. But at the same time, I think that there is, I just wanted to give notice that we might be looking to refer this back to staff. And I just wanted to say that at this point, wanted to just give notice of that.
Okay, so we'll let you elaborate further later, but let's hear from the public delegations first. So first on the list is Chad Rollins from Action Sandy Hill. Good morning and welcome to the subcommittee. I think you know the rules well, Chad, but for the sake of everybody, when you come up to the front, you have 5 minutes to speak, and then there's also the opportunity for questions from committee members. So good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to this file. My name is Chad Rollins. I'm president of Action Sandy Hill. I also live on Coburg Street, just a few blocks from this property. I'm here today just to express our strong opposition to the application to demolish and replace the Ugandan High Commission's Chancery building at 231 Coburg. You've already heard, I think, sufficient information about the fact that this is in a heritage conservation district and it is identified as a contributing building in that district. The district plan, I think it's important to mention, states clearly that contributing buildings are important to be maintained in order to keep the character of the district. The heritage value, as I understand it, of a district lies in the amalgam of those contributing buildings. And if that's the case, really how many of those buildings can we lose before the district begins to lose its value? The plan for this district actually states that its value, its cultural heritage value, lies in its association with the development of Sandy Hill in the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly as an upper middle class neighborhood that was home to many politicians and senior civil servants, including Prime Ministers MacDonald, Laurier, Mackenzie King, and Pearson. This building, which was built in the mid-20th century and was home to Prime Minister Pearson, certainly seems to fit precisely with that description of the cultural heritage value of the district. It is difficult to understand, therefore, how staff have been able to dismiss this as a marginal building. According to the proponent, they had to vacate the building urgently for their safety about 4 years ago, and it has stood vacant since. In the last several months, several groups have been taken on tours of the building. Indeed, the proponent gave members of ASH a tour of this building in April of 2017. We certainly were not required to wear hard hats, masks, or any other kind of protective equipment, so I have a little bit of an issue with saying that the building is unsafe. The building remains standing, and the proponents have admitted to us that it was in a much better state of repair when they vacated the building. Sadly, they've left it vacant, unheated, leaking, and unmaintained for 4 years. This has compounded the problems, and it's a classic example of demolition through neglect. The staff report accepts that the problem is caused by differential settling of the foundation due to unstable soil condition in Sandy Hill. But as somebody who lives just a few blocks away, I can tell you everybody in Sandy Hill has to contend with that issue all the time. In the 5 years I've lived in my house, I've had to hire geotechnical engineers, structural engineers due to settling, due to sound issues with the deleted clay soil. So I don't think that alone should be sufficient grounds for demolition. The fact is that repairing these kinds of foundations requires underpinning and serious intervention. During the 30 years the Ugandan High Commission has owned the building, they have patched the cracks, absolutely, but they have never underpinned the foundation. They have never undertaken the real major repairs that need to happen to stabilize the building. It is a contributing building in the district. It was the home of former Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson when he was our Minister of External Affairs, when he dealt with the Suez intervention and was awarded the Nobel Prize for his efforts. It seems difficult to say that your home doesn't play a part or a role in your life when you're working on something like that. I can't imagine that he worked on that in the office and was completely divorced from it when he came home. I'm sure his home played a role. Approving the demolition of a contributing building in an HCD, in our opinion, sends the wrong message, and it poses a serious threat to all of our heritage conservation districts. Approving such a demolition when the building has been so clearly neglected is equally troubling. We hope that you'll send the right message today by recommending that Planning Committee and Council deny the request to demolish and replace this important piece of our cultural heritage. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for the intervention. There is a question from a member. If you can stay for a moment, Member Smallwood.
Thank you. Chad, you mentioned that you live in the neighborhood and that many of your neighbors share the same issue of the settling of their houses. I have properties around there and I have the same thing too. Did the engineers suggest to you that you should drive piles 20 meters down to the bedrock to deal with the problem of your house, or did they suggest a simple underpinning?
Not in my particular case, no. I had to do some repairs and some underpinning, but I have certainly seen neighbors who've had to drive piles down to bedrock in order to support the sinking foundations. Sure. I've had at least one neighbor who spent about $150,000 doing that at a corner of their property.
Okay. And how serious was their subsiding? Was it similar to this, or was it?
It was similar. You had a very noticeable dip as you walked towards that corner of the property, and cracking of the foundation, cracking of the exterior brick, cracking to the plaster and the floors inside.
Right. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Other questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for coming to speak this morning.
Thank you.
Next speaker on the list is Ryan Shackleton and Brittany Ann Bose. Maybe staff can move over to provide some space. Thank you. Good morning and welcome to the subcommittee. You have 5 minutes if you can introduce yourself and go ahead, please.
We do have a PowerPoint. I'm Ryan Shackleton, the Director of No History.
I'm Brittany Ann Boss. I'm one of the associates with No History.
Before you start, you're all set up. Okay, great. Okay. Is your presentation on the disc?
It is, yep.
Can we? I don't want you to lose your 5 minutes, you see, so.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, over to you.
Great, thank you. So we're a historical research firm here in Ottawa. We were hired by Action Sandy Hill last week to look into this property. We are not doing a heritage assessment on this. Rather, we're here to provide a history of Lester B. Pearson during his tenure. There was some doubt as to whether his residence was there. So what we want to really do is just highlight that this was the home of Lester B. Pearson. It's been confirmed in the directories. And it's at a prominent time in his career, and I think that's not being played enough in this, and not his prime ministerial career, but his diplomatic career. The building itself is a waypoint for an important moment in Canadian history, the Nobel Peace Prize, which I'll get into, and it's part of a political heritage landscape in Sandy Hill. So this comes at the height of the golden age of Canadian foreign policy, also termed Pearsonian diplomacy. Pearson was involved with the Palestinian partition in 1947. He was an architect of NATO in 49. He helped broker the Korean War truce in 53 and was president of the UN General Assembly in 1954. We see in 1955, 1954, he purchases 231 Coburg Avenue, with his wife. We get to 1956, which is the Suez Crisis. Because of that Suez Crisis, it was the birth of peacekeeping, something that Canadians have become internationally known for. And he's awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 57. 1958, the reason he leaves the property is to go to Stornoway as the leader of the opposition. During the speech for the Peace Prize, it was stated, never since the end of the last war has the world situation been darker than during Suez Crisis. This wasn't a little trade negotiation. This was a critical point in the Cold War that Lester B. Pearson stepped in with Pearsonian diplomacy. He was cited the man who contributed more than anyone else to save the world at this time. That man was Lester B. Pearson. So Life magazine featured him in an article that year. I'll just note that the Peace Prize hadn't been given for 2 years prior. There was no one in the world deserving of it until Lester Pearson received it. This is what it was said. At home, he spends his evening with wife Marion. They live in a 7-room apartment a mile and a half from Parliament. Pearson walks to work for exercise. And this is the picture of Pearson after he received his prize in the apartment. That's at his home. So we know that this is an extremely significant moment for Canadians and Canadian history. He's the only person to have won a Nobel Peace Prize, or the only Canadian. It's also the invention of part of our cultural identity, peacekeeping. Additionally, we see, this is taken from Prime Minister's Row. This is the location here. These are the other locations of past prime ministers or fathers of confederations. And what we see here is a community of political spaces. We don't fully understand how they interrelate yet. I think some social network analysis on this, but further to what Chad said, that walk to work every day, that's where ideas could have been generated. The political heritage landscape has a tangible heritage markers like this home, and they tell the personal histories of Canadian leadership. And I will say part of that Pearsonian diplomacy is represented, I think, in that house. I mean, he's the Minister of External Affairs staying in an apartment that they bought as an income property because he's a humble man, not overly ambitious, which is detailed in John English's biography of him. It's a collection of places rather than individual parts, and I think we need to consider that area and all of those places in Sandy Hill as part of that collection. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Are there any questions of the speaker from members of the committee? I see none, so thank you for coming out this morning.
Thank you.
Next speaker on the list is Robert Martin of Robertson Martin Architects.
No.
Good morning and welcome to the subcommittee.
Good morning, Chair and members of committee. I would like to start off by saying that one of our primary roles in this city and in our practice is one of heritage conservation. So when we were approached to offer a CHIS on this particular project, our first stance would initially be one of retention of the heritage asset and the contribution to the district. And so, we were initially a little bit tentative, but as we were provided with some of the documents and were able to actually tour the building itself, a more, or sort of a different opinion began to form. So, we're very cognizant of the character of the district, the connections to Mr. Pearson that have been made. His wife purchased this building for a period in time. But we've really guided our cultural heritage impact statement on the, heritage character of the district. So, we've looked at it under the categories of design value, cultural historic value, and heritage district attributes, as well as the contextual value. And, again, we have extensive experience with a lot of very high value exemplar buildings and what I would call heroic efforts to restore these buildings. And so it was with a certain degree of kind of grudging reluctance when we began to, stitch together all of the factors that have been mentioned, including, various hazardous materials, abatement of mold, structural problems, so the almost complete building redo and this sort of extensive effort that would still end up with a building that didn't meet a client's functional program. So, we're of the value that this, the existing building itself demolished an earlier building. It's not a particularly high value exemplar of any kind of architectural style. And even if one sort of added to the scoring based on Pearson's connections, we still end up with a score under 50 out of 100. And so, in totality, when we look at the various factors, I guess our assessment in the CHIS was that the replacement building could be guided by the attributes of the district. And, that then directs us to the eclectic mix of architectural styles, ease of use of materials, the kind of massing scale, residential feel. And as Ms. Coots had indicated, we've made a series of recommendations for improvements in the design, toward this end. And so, overall, our conclusion was that the replacement of this building would in no way detract from the heritage character under those various categories of the district, and that the new replacement could be guided by the attributes that are indicated in the district study as well. So with that, I will entertain questions.
Member Smollett?
Thank you. In the previous presentation, I thought was very impressive. Did you, in your study, do you have any reason to disagree with anything that was presented to us in that previous presentation about the history and the importance of Lester Pearson that time in his career, and the fact that he was there and in a very important time in Canadian history? Do you have any disagreement with that?
I have no disagreement with that history. However, I think this history is almost becoming a proxy for the building itself. All of that history can and should be told with or without this building. It's not that history in no way is reduced by having this building here or not.
I have one other question. In your research, did you review the structural report that we have, and did you find any issues with the report or the conclusions of the report?
I have reviewed the structural reports and geotechnical studies. I don't have any issue with them per se. I think we've said to the design architects and to city staff, virtually any structure can be saved if you've put enough technical know-how and money at it. So it's not a question of if this building could be stabilized. It's just a question of, does it make sense in these sort of agglomeration of challenges, including, barrier-free access and structural and environmental. Does it make sense to take heroic efforts for a marginal building?
I have a question myself, and I guess it goes to an issue that I'm struggling with as I am listening to the various speakers. Mr. Martin, do you think owners in the City of Ottawa of designated buildings under Part 4 or contributing buildings in heritage conservation districts have a responsibility to ensure that the buildings they own, from the point of ownership, from the date of ownership onwards, remain in a condition that's livable so that they don't require demolition? Do you feel that owners have that responsibility?
I do feel that owners, for listed heritage assets, do have a responsibility to maintain buildings. And
and how long do you understand that your client has owned this building?
I understand since, I think, 1985.
So 33 years.
Something like that, yes. 33
years.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That's all. Yeah. Next speaker on the list is Judah Malalu, architect for 1024 Architecture Incorporated. Good morning and welcome to the subcommittee.
Thank you.
You have 5 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members. Don't really have too much to say in terms of the condition of a building, because that's been stated by Ms. Coots and reiterated by Mr. Martin. I just want to speak to the idea of neighborhoods and what they mean to us culturally and historically. And when we look at Sandy Hill and its tapestry of architectural fabric, it does tell a story, a history of that neighborhood that, during different times in its history, there has been additions to the neighborhood, and that's what makes it special. It's not the stasis of, the historical fabric, but that dynamic input that is generated by, necessity. And in this case, the necessity, regrettably, comes from a building that is in an appalling state, to be honest. We did take Action Sandy Hill, and we did a lot of community engagement prior to, coming up with the scheme that is before you today. And not only did we engage with Action Sandy Hill to empirically take them through the building to demonstrate the condition that it's in. I do understand the history and I respect it. I understand the position of the neighborhood, and it's totally understandable. But what has to be considered is the current state of the building. Like, what does it take to rehabilitate the building? What is that threshold? What is the reasonable, threshold? Like Mr. Martin was saying, yes, heroic measures can be adopted to rehabilitate any building. But again, what is the threshold? Our clients vacated the building because it was structurally unsafe and environmentally unhealthy. We all know the dangers of mold. You can't be in a mold environment for a day. You just can't. Right? Regardless of whether the building was neglected or not, and that is an argument that can be had. And clients with challenged properties like this make decisions based on the immediacy of what the problem is. And most of it, as it appeared to them, was essentially just cracking. But what they didn't realize was that they were essentially putting a band-aid on a compound fracture. Because of this differential settlement problem, the building just kept cracking and cracking. There were several instances where sections of the slab in the basement had to be replaced. So it is not a fair assessment to just easily say it's demolition by neglect, when all empirical evidence and engineering evidence point to a much greater issue. And that is why we're here today, essentially. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you. Hold on one moment. I know there are questions. Councillor McKinney.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming out this morning. I just want to pick up on the demolition by neglect because, in the area of the city that I represent, it happens often. And often what happens, recently, I guess the most recent one was, a new owner assumed a building that had been, at the point of demolition. We ended up demolishing it because it had been neglected, but by a previous owner. And although I didn't agree with that, I think that when you purchase a building, I think that you assume all the responsibilities for it. But am I correct in the information that we have today that the ownership of this building has been the same ownership since 1984?
Yes, you are correct.
Okay. So I just wonder at what point we got to on this building, or why it wouldn't have been determined earlier on when it could have been, kept up in better condition and saved, why that didn't occur.
Well, that is a fair question, and to be quite honest, I honestly don't know. What I can speak to is, the relative. As professionals, we have the advantage of being able to assess things from an empirical standpoint, and then draw conclusions based on that. That leads to other, investigations, if you will. But in this case, I honestly, can't say why more measures were not taken to. My humble opinion is that they just simply didn't know the extent of the problem.
But there is a responsibility on behalf of an owner of a building.
Oh, no,
especially in a heritage
absolutely,
conservation district,
absolutely.
to make sure that it's being kept up to the standards that the municipality, the neighborhood expects.
No. All those standards within reason were kept up to the point where they realized, when ceilings start, caving in on you, that, life safety takes precedence over, everything else. So when ceilings start caving in, no person in their right mind would want to stay in a property where, the structure is falling in on them. And that is what's happening with this building.
Thank you. I would still argue, though, I don't support the staff recommendation today, but I would argue that any owner does have a responsibility to keep up a property.
And I do agree with you 100%. Every owner has a responsibility.
Okay, thank you very much for coming out this morning. One other question, from Member Smollett.
Certainly.
Thank you. You made the comment that the building was structurally unsafe. I've looked through the engineer's report, and I see nothing that indicates the building's structurally unsafe. It appears that, and from my observation and from the photos, there's been about a 1-inch subsidence of the building, which is extraordinarily common in the shifting sands of Sandy Hill. So I've seen a couple of times, and I would be really interested to know that, in fact, in the staff report, it also mentions the building being declared unsafe. Who declared it unsafe? I don't see any report stating that the building is unsafe. It appears that there is a bit of subsidence, which is quite common. There's mold, which is as a result of the owner not taking care of water infiltration. There was some plaster that fell down, which also is a result of the owner's maintenance of the building. So can you just explain to me your comment that the building was structurally unsafe?
Well, that's exactly, with all due respect, I can't speak to that decision to vacate the building. But from my experience, I have 25 years experience working in an architectural firm that does heritage conservation, adaptive reuse. And my empirical opinion of the building, with collapsing ceilings and water gushing down the walls, for me that constitutes unsafe.
Well, I have 40 years experience restoring historic buildings, and I have many buildings that have subsided much more than 1 inch. And I wouldn't abandon them, I would repair them.
Well, that again I can't speak to because, the decision to vacate I was not part of. But I can only speak to the current conditions of the building and the engineering reports that support that, the position that we've adopted.
The engineering report I see says that there's no evidence that they can see that any work was done to repair the foundation other than patching it.
Okay, I'm going to cut off the discussion because we're not going to get into a debate. I don't think there are any more questions. So I see none, so thank you for coming this morning.
Thank you kindly.
And we'll move to our next speaker, who is David Fleming from Heritage Ottawa. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I refer you to the letter that our President, David Jean, sent to the committee concerning this matter. We are opposed to the recommendation. I'm not going to go through in detail what we said in our letter, But I just want to make a couple of points. For us, this is an example of demolition by neglect. For more than a decade, Heritage Ottawa has been urging the city to take action to try to prevent buildings from reaching a state where the owner perceives that they have no choice but to demolish the building, especially in heritage conservation districts. The question is not whether the owner has neglected the building, because I think that's obvious, but whether the owner has a responsibility and will be held accountable by this committee and by the City Council for allowing this to deteriorate. This is a contributing building in a heritage conservation district that's associated with the development of Sandy Hill in the 19th and 20th centuries. It further states that this district has historical associations with prime ministers and politicians. This was the home, briefly once, of a prime minister before, when he was a politician, and before he was a politician, when he was a civil servant. So this is all part of the cultural heritage value of this particular heritage conservation district. Not generally, but this district. If you look at the historical association, an argument might be made that this does not reflect Lester B. Pearson as much as Pearson House does. But we're looking at it as part of the details and the criteria for the district. Whether it's of marginal architectural value, I can't argue that. I'm not an architect. But I think it does reflect these kind of buildings that were constructed during the Second World War when there was a pressure put on housing in Ottawa. And I think this building reflects that era. So we think that the current building should be kept. If for some reason it gets demolished, we welcome the changes in the upgrade of the design of the new building, but we hope we never have to get to that point. But there are some other things that we would like to address if and when that happens, but we'll do that at another time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Any questions for Mr. Fleming? Seeing none, thank you for coming out this morning. So that is the end of our list of public delegations. So questions and comments, Member Smallwood?
I had a question for staff.
Okay.
In the staff report to us, recommendation 1, it says in 2014 the Ugandan High Commission was declared unsafe due to cracking caused by ongoing differential setting of its foundation walls. I'm just wondering, by whom was it declared? Was it city building inspector that declared the building unsafe?
In 2014, because of the cracking and the cracks in the walls, etc., the inhabitants decided it was no longer safe for them as public servants to work in the building, and so they looked for lease space and moved to another space. So their perception was that because of the ongoing cracking, and I don't know exactly whose opinion they sought or whether it was their own opinion, that they could not guarantee a safe workspace for the workers, and they left.
It would be helpful, certainly for me as a committee member, that if a statement is made that a building is declared unsafe, that we be given some indication whether it was self-declared, the owner decided it was unsafe, or the city did. Continuing on in the report, it said efforts were made to repair the cracking and shifting of the structure. I don't see any evidence in the engineer's report that any efforts were made to prevent the shifting of the structure. I can refer you to page 3 of the engineer's report, if that's helpful. He says specifically, in the engineer's report to us, it says fundamental cause of the building movement was not resolved, and it is not clear if any attempt was made to resolve it. So this is the engineer's report that we were provided with. And it certainly doesn't seem that there was any evidence of any attempts, and certainly from what I can see, there's no evidence that any attempts were ever made to properly either underpin or do any other efforts to stop the shifting. It seems that all that was ever done was some surface patching.
Is that a question, Mr.
Yes, it is. Am I correct in saying that it appears your statement here is that efforts were made to repair the cracking and the shifting of the structure? What I'm asking you is, I see no evidence that any efforts were made to prevent the shifting of the structure, and I'm referring to the engineer's report that we were provided with.
Mr. Chair, perhaps that was a misinterpretation on my part. I can say that the Ugandans in their 20 years did try to fix the buildings. Perhaps they didn't have the expertise, but perhaps shifting is not is overstated, and I apologize if there is a misinterpretation. Certainly, the point is that there were attempts to fix the building, perhaps on the part of a less sophisticated property owner who didn't realize the extent to. I mean, I can't speak for them, but there were efforts made, and they no longer felt safe. And everyone is entitled to a safe workplace, whether it's declared unsafe by themselves or someone else. If you do not feel safe where you work, you should not be required to work there, and they left the building.
Also, with respect to the report, it mentions about the hazardous materials, which sounds very scary, but every building constructed prior to 1970 is most probably going to have hazardous materials, whether it be lead or asbestos or whatever. So just for the sake of the committee, I think it does lead, I think sometimes a report might be given to an occupant saying there are hazardous materials here. Lead paint is a hazardous material. Lead paint was used in every house prior to 1970. Asbestos was used to insulate pipes. So I think it's just helpful for us to realize that it is not unusual to be in an old building that a DSR would show some hazardous materials in it.
No, that's correct. Buildings have hazardous materials in them, and but asbestos, lead, paint, etc. So,
will we have a chance to speak to the engineer? Because I did have some concerns about the engineer's report. Several concerns. Should I raise them with staff, or?
Well, given the Vice Chair's allusion to a motion that he plans to table, I suggest that you hold off on those questions. Okay. Although, it should be noted for the record that in future, if applicants are going to rely on information in the report, it would be wise to bring forward witnesses who can speak to it. So, unfortunately, we don't have that now, but I think the issue will be moot if the Vice Chair's motion is carried by this committee. So, other questions or comments for staff? Mr. Vice Chair?
It's just one question, and this has to do with the city's rule in inspecting the building under the Property Standards Act between 2014 and 2017, knowing that the building was allowed to be vacant and that there were some problems with the foundations, was there an inspection done by the City Property Standards Department to examine whether or not this building was in the process of being allowed to be demolished through neglect, as we have a number of other buildings in the city? What is the status? Was there anything actually done to initiate a city inspection on the building for that purpose?
The condition of the building, we first started dealing with the Ugandan High Commission in 2015. So for the first year, there was no, from my understanding, no public awareness of the reasons that it was, was abandoned, and then the building was subsequently placed on the vacant building watch list that as a result of the Heritage Matters Task Force. And I understand that I don't know whether there was an internal examination, but there was, that when it was added, there was an inspection made, but no orders were issued.
Just so that I understand this, because the public is very much relying on the city to inspect buildings because of suspicion of demolition by neglect. So are you saying that their city staff did actually inspect the building but decided not to put any orders on it?
No, there wasn't. It was Heritage staff were invited to tour the building in 2015, and we saw the effect of the shifting and the cracking walls and the sloping floors, and then it was the building was at the time it was then put on the Heritage Matters watch list, but I cannot. There were no property standards orders issued against it.
I don't want to belabor this, but was there a property standards inspection done?
It is my understanding that there was, but not internal. But I was consulting the notes, and the person who made them has retired, and I couldn't reach that conclusion, but I did try. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chair. I did try.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Councillor Floyd?
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Puis merci les membres du comité pour vos questions à point, selon moi. Je pense qu'il y a quelques éléments. Évidemment, l'historique du quartier en est un primaire. On connaît également l'aspect plus socio-comportemental au niveau de la présence de M. Pearson. Et puis, je pense que vous avez touché sur le point sensible. Il y a eu une période où le Haut-Commissariat a décidé de ne pas habiter dans le bâtiment. C'est une raison qui est peut-être de leur partie. On a entendu que c'était de leur volonté. Mais il n'y a aucune mesure qui avait été prise à cette époque-là pour corriger l'inquiétude de leurs employés ou de notre côté au niveau du code du bâtiment, au niveau des réglementations, au niveau du code pour les pompiers, pour la protection. Il n'y a eu aucune demande ou aucun élément qui a démontré que le bâtiment était compromis. Donc, dans cette mesure-là, je pense que ce serait d'aller très, très loin de permettre une démolition de ce bâtiment-là quand il y a des mesures qui sont peut-être coûteuses, mais qui sont importantes à prendre pour préserver le bâtiment. On demande ça à tous les résidents. Moi, je pense qu'on doit, à un certain niveau aussi, s'assurer que les partenaires nationaux et internationaux, dont les ambassades, dont les hauts commissariats, respectent le patrimoine bâti de notre région, de notre communauté. Donc, sur ce, je vous encourage à appuyer la motion du vice-président. I have a technical question, Mr. Chair, on the motion, because I do think it's heading in the right direction in ensuring transparency and that committee have the proper information. Will the report summary from the independent report come back to Built Heritage? And at that point, will committee make its decision on the report? Is that the next steps?
Correct. Actually, why don't we have the Vice Chair introduce the motion so we all know what specific language is in that motion, and then we can take up that question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to introduce this motion, and I think that in introducing it, I just have to comment that the case that is made to approve the application is not as strong as I think we would like it to be. And I think that the arguments by Heritage Ottawa and Action Sandy Hill are quite formidable and clear. And I think that the reports, such as the engineering report that was commissioned by the owner, leaves a lot of things up in the air and is not as clear as we would like it to be. And I think also because there is a good sense that in the period between 2014 and 2017, that the building was neglected. And in that regard, the motion that I'm going to make is to ask for an independent engineering review commissioned by the city. So I'll read the motion now. It's a bit long, and if you wouldn't mind bearing with me on that. whereas the members of the Built Heritage Subcommittee have requested additional review of engineering issues and the possible retention of at least portions of the building at 231 Cobourg Street, a building designated under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act. Therefore, be it resolved that the application to demolish the building at 231 Cobourg Street, a Category 3 building in the Laurie Wilbrod Heritage Conservation District, be referred to staff for further review, and that the city be directed to engage a structural engineer with heritage experience to provide an independent engineering report which speaks to the structure of the existing building, and based on the additional information in the independent review, that the applicant be encouraged to prepare a revised application that retains or incorporates a significant portion of the existing building, or a new design that better reflects the recommendations contained in the applicant's Cultural Heritage Impact Statement, and be it further resolved that the Built Heritage Subcommittee refer this matter to staff with request that the revised report be brought back to the Built Heritage Subcommittee in such time as to permit consideration by the Subcommittee, Planning Committee, and City Council prior to May the 9th, 2018. I know that's long, but I think that it serves to do.
Yeah, and I think in answer to your question, Councillor Fleury, if this motion were carried by this committee, then the expectation would be that the independent structural report would form a document as part of the staff report coming back to this committee in April. So any questions to the Vice Chair on his proposed motion? Councillor Wilkinson?
There's about 3 different things in that motion which gives me a bit of a problem. I have no problem getting the additional information, but you've almost in that motion already decided that that motion is going to say something, so they have to revise it because, you know, the report's going to say that. And I really think it should be divided. I think we get that. Staff should review that with the owner to find out if there are alternatives. But you've gone much further than that.
It's actually an or. So it leaves the possibility that...
Well, it's where it says the expected revised site plan that retains incorporation of significant portion of existing buildings or a new design that better reflects the recommendation contained. Does that mean they could come back with this same one but reflecting the engineering report in it? It's a little bit confusing.
I could speak to that if you like. I think that if you look at the applicant's cultural heritage impact statement prepared by Robertson Martin, in there they have 3 recommendations, and the recommendations relate to making a replacement building reflect the residential character rather than institutional character of the proposal. And that comes from the applicant's own heritage consultant. So I think that would be an active element in revisiting the design.
So in looking at the design a little bit better. Okay, like that, that's okay then.
Okay, maybe I'll provide just a few observations on this file. I guess firstly, I support the Vice Chair's proposed referral motion for a couple of reasons. The first is, we've learned today that we have an owner of a building that has owned it for 34 years, and during that time has made choices about whether to keep it into a state that would provide for its further occupancy. Those choices clearly led to a situation where we may be faced with a situation where demolition is something that needs to be considered, but surely as the public entity responsible for heritage protection in the city, our message has to be one of not allowing that kind of moral hazard. Because if this committee simply rubber stamps a recommendation for demolition, then the message that we're sending to all designated buildings in the city is, hey, you, as long as you want, make choices where you're not bearing the cost, but the public bears the cost in terms of the loss of heritage resources. And I think it would be a mistake for us to agree with the staff recommendation, both for this particular case and for the general message that it sends about a very clear responsibility acknowledged by the author of the CHIS that owners of heritage properties have in the city to maintain their property in a state that does not require demolition. And that message, I think, needs to be made very, very loud and clear by this committee. I would encourage staff, if this motion is passed, to think long and hard about the message that this committee is sending. On that point, I was disappointed to learn that staff relied on a series of information items that were not reflected in the report. So I would ask that staff include the geotechnical studies that were made mention. They are not included in this. There was mention of a second engineering study. It was not included in this series of documents. I think in order for us to make the decisions that residents of the city expect of us, we need to have all of the relevant information at hand. And my advice to the applicant, when this does come back to us in April, please ensure that you have someone who can speak to the engineering portions of this, but also please make best efforts. I think what you're hearing from the committee today is a very keen interest in the applicant giving this another go, trying harder to respect what the community, what this committee, what a number of other speakers have stated represents an important building of cultural heritage value in Sandy Hill and in this Heritage Conservation District. So on that note, just to indicate that I too support the Vice Chair's motion. And if there are no other questions or comments, I'll put it before the committee. Is that motion carried? Carried. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. And we will now go to our final items. Any notices of motion? Any inquiries? No other business that I'm aware of. So we are adjourned, and our next meeting is Thursday, 8th of March, 2018. Thanks.